the Orifeme races that were created once the Wisadek agreements had been made and they broke through to this matrix, through the phantom matrix. The Orifeme were created after the Azarites fell. And once that occurred, in response to the Orifeme Guardians being created, the Jehovian Anunnaki created the Anunnaki. They were the avengers of Anu. Their purpose was to destroy the human lineage, any of the human lineages, because their objective was to take over the time matrix. So all of the Anunnaki races came out of that and have at their core imprint. They genetically have that core intention. They were created with that core intention, and it's proved to be very hard for them to overcome. They also were programmed with the idea that they were superior, they were elite. They should be the ones running the time matrix because they're so much better than we are. There's an arrogance that goes with their pattern. That was what Thoth's downfall was. So the Anunnaki races came originally out of the Jehovian Anunnaki bipedal, having 2 feet. Actually, they were dolphins with feet and hand type things. They could go on land or they could go on water, and they were a density 2 and 3 race. So they were semi-etheric and etheric density. They downscaled them here and put them in our waters as certain types of dolphins, but not all of the dolphins are of them. Some of the dolphins are of the Brahmarama races, the cetacean races that were put here to counteract what their dolphins were doing. Now the Jehovian Anunnaki lineage, when they invaded the Leviathan races, created their Antichristos Grail line, just like the Anu Seraphim ones, the Pleiadian Nibiru ones did. You also have the Odedicron reptilian races that originally got caught in the fall without meaning to, but some of them very much digressed from that point. And you have the Omicron Draconian dragon moths. They all got involved. So you have this big line of Leviathan races being invaded and directed by each of their creator gods here to fulfill the agenda of their particular creator gods. The warring on this planet has been because everybody's been being used as little armies to fight these phantom matrix battles that are going on. For ages, the Anu Seraphim Anunnaki were fighting with the Jehovian Anunnaki, trying to annihilate each other, and both of them were fighting with the Draconians, and the Odedicron would side with whoever would not try to destroy them, because everybody is trying to get them out of the way. And what we've seen on this planet is a progressive nightmare that's been their nightmare that they brought here. Now, when we get into some of the names that are associated with these lines, there's a whole bunch of names. It'll take me forever to go through all of them. But they were basically, on this side of this graph, we show, like right over here, not totally over to the end over here, but over in this section. This is the Anu Seraphim, Pleiadian, Nibiruan crew. All right, when we go over here further, this lineage is the Jehovian Anunnaki crew. We go over here, it's Odedicron, and over here, the Omicron Draconian. Now, over on this end are those kind of misfits of the universe that are the Marduk line, which are the Draconian combined with the Anunnaki, and they tend to do their own thing, and they've had a lot of problems because they're a minority compared to the other races, but they still had their 2 cents in here. What these groups did was the Pleiadian Nibiruan Anunnaki created lines of Leviathan races by raiding the experiments, called the Elulkum, the Adiruans, the Lilithan, and the Azuriel. Now they later combined their groups to, these were called the Beli Kudman, by the way, those particular races of Earth, Leviathan, that were of the Nibiruan and Pleiadian descent, were called the Beli Kudman. Now, between 22,340 BC and 10,500 BC, those races were upgraded by combining them with other things, progressively raiding angelic human races to get more of their gene code. They became the Atalans, and they combined the Adiruans, the Lilithan, and the Azuriel. This is Thoth's group, Samjaze's group, and who are these guys over here? The Enlil group, which are a reptilian group, Nibiruan reptilian group. They were combined, their Leviathan races were combined to form the Atalan king line. And of the Atalan king line, there were the Atlas line, who came out of the Enlil Odedicron, the Osiris line, which was part Enki and part Samjazi, and the Larsa line, which was taking all of them and putting them all together. The Larsa kings were Atlantean king lines, the Atlantean Antichristos king lines, that were responsible for the progressive invasion and taking over the territories of Atlantis. Atlantis at one point was a large continent. There were certain things done, I believe that was way back, that was in, I think, what was that, 50,000 BC they did that? I forget. Or was that 25,000? There were 2 different periods in the Atlantean mess. That's on the other chart. But anyway, the first one took down most of the continent, leaving island nations. The island nations that were left are what we call England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales up in the north. That was Lohas, Atlantis. Bermuda area, what we call the Bermuda Islands now, is the tiny remnants of what was a very large central area called Nohasa, Atlantis. And this is where the Noah line comes from. When we get into Noah and Abraham and all these guys, Nohasa, Atlantis is where it came from. The Noah line was the line of Leviathans that came up from that particular region. And I'll show in a minute where they fit. And then there was Brua Atlantis, which now is down in the Florida area, Sarasota, Florida, and coming down into where I think Cuba and those kind of things are down there, and up into the Bimini Islands. So these were, these are the areas that were progressively, where the raiding started, where the major raiding started. From there, they literally went through every corner of the planet. And the corners of the planet they were looking for were the corners of the planet where the 12 tribes lived. Because the 12 tribes, there are 12 stargates and 12 Q sites, which are the ones that connect to the inner Earth temples. Those are the most sacred sites on the planet because they're the control sites for the planetary grids. These were the sites that that were targeted for invasion. We've looked at the chart of that before, where you can see where some of the interesting action that has taken place. I mean, it's still taking place down in the Middle East, and like in Iraq and Iran, they have the Gate 10 connection things. That you can just watch, look at the maps and see where the gates are and see how peoples have fought with each other and why. So we got to the Attilan king lines, and they formed the Osiris kings that came up, that eventually came down through Egypt as the invader races of Egypt. We had the Atlas king lines, and they almost faded away. Then they combined with the Osiris lines later and became the Horus lines. All right, so there's like all this combining of Leviathan races. These are just the Leviathan races, and they would raid different tribes of humans to pick up more of the human coding. The Larsa kings are interesting because there is physical evidence left, a few pieces they forgot to pick up, of the Larsa tablets that are the king lists. They have them, carved in stone, and interestingly, Enoch's name is listed on the Larsa king lists because there was a time in 10,500 BC in a thing called the Luciferian Conquest, where Enoch decided he would break the Emerald Covenant and join with the other Anunnaki races. If you can't beat them, join them, was basically the approach he took. Enoch didn't do it for the same reasons that Thoth did. Thoth had an arrogance problem, still does. Thoth did it for personal gain and for gain for his people, from an egotism, as opposed to Enoch doing it because he figured they had so much control at this point that if they didn't cooperate and they won, that his races would be destroyed completely by the Thoth groups because they didn't cooperate. So he had joined, and it was a bad decision, but he joined, and they led their people into taking what had originally been a bioregenesis program, hybridization program, to get them back into the Christos imprint, and they decided to create raider races that would progressively take over instead. Now, what came out of these guys? At the same time, you also have, developing over on this side, another set of interesting people that were in opposition to the Attilan king lines that were the Palladian Nibiruan primarily. You had the Jehovian Anunnaki, the pure strain Jehovian Anunnaki. Now, for a while, Enoch was the leader of those. As before he turned, he was the one that was helping the Jehovian Anunnaki, the hybrids, get back into the the Emerald Covenant. But there was another group of Jehovian Anunnaki that were not Emerald Covenant at all. Marduk. They were the Urantia. Another name for this group is the Marduk. They had a sub-race called the Admians. I'm the Dragon Queen. All right, this is where you start to get the Satane family of those. You combine that, you get a Luciferian. Becomes the Adami. The Luciferian imprint was used to. We had the Admians combined with the Nephites, the Nibiru and the Palladian levels. So you had the Palladian, Nibiru, and Anunnaki. They progressively came up and became the Thoth groups fit into this. Thoth is one of the shining stars. All right, so now we're getting to something. The Hasim. Yes, he almost made it to Christendom. From the Hasim, we ended up with Hassa kings, and they ended up with. So there's that group, which were the ones that combined later with three primary raider races that combined with the became involved with the Leviathans to form something, a new hybrid, a super hybrid. The ones that was intended to be the master hybrid that would take over the planet. They was called the Adam Palladians. They're the angelic. Now the original human race from Tara, Anunnaki races. There was one group of several different divisions. They're called the Enki human races. It was called that combined with another group. To get it exactly right, the Marduk Satane family. Adami Kudim. This is where so they literally created their own. It's referring to one of the Draconian by rating the races here, and they called it the Anu Seraphim. This is where the Metatronic pattern. This is where the path of Arimathea actually started. It started way back there in Atlantis. Progressively, now this stuff was taking place before the flood, all right, before the flood where all the records were taken away. By the time the flood occurred, and the flood occurred in 9558 BC, it was orchestrated. There was a big rally that took place in 10,500 called the Luciferian Conquest, and this is when the Enoch groups joined with the Thoth groups, and they created the Anunnaki legions, and they combined their races to begin forming the master race, to make that Adam Kadmon race that would take over this planet. And they together chose to get rid of everything else they didn't want on the planet at the time. Now, they couldn't get rid of humans completely because humans had the keys to the stargates. And if they didn't run those keys in a stellar activation cycle, what would happen to the planet is the stargates would not open and the planet would go into pole shift. That's a protection device that was put here. If humans weren't here, humans and indigos weren't here to run the security codes through the DNA, that meant there was something wrong because humans are supposed to be here as the guardians. And if the guardians weren't here and the gate keys weren't put in, the place would simply roll and the gates would shut, so nothing could come in and take it over. So they had to keep us here, but they had to make us stupid so we wouldn't be able to fight, head on to stop them from what they were doing, because technically humans and indigos can run 1,000,000 times more frequency power than any of these guys can if their DNA is functioning properly. So the Luciferian covenant was the agreement that Enoch entered and his groups entered. This is where you had a strain of the Jehovian Anunnaki, the Nohasim, that were under Enoch's control, joining with the Pleiadian Nibiruan Anunnaki races to form a master raider race. You also had a bunch of the Jehovian Anunnaki Leviathans and their creator gods that didn't want to do that. So they created an opposing line. They became the Hassa kings. The Hassa kings moved later, after the flood, moved into Assyria and Akkadia. There was another branch of them that combined with the Odedicron reptilians, and another branch that combined with the Omicron draconians, where you ended up with something called the Teozin, the Lathian, and the Etruan king lines, Atlantean Antichristos king lines. From them, you ended up with the Hassad king lines, the Hellenium king lines. Notice some of these words. They're words in our history. They're words in our history that human beings have been conned into thinking apply to them, but they don't apply to most of the people on the planet. Because, interestingly, even though the invasion here and the infiltration has been huge, there are still more humans and indigos combined than there are Leviathans. That's one little secret they don't want anybody to know. That's their weak point. Okay. These lines came up. So you have this Draconian line. These are the Dragon Kings, the ones that combined with the Omicron Draconians, the Hassad Kings. This is a lot of the stuff you see going on in the Middle East that later got into the Ahala Kings and those kind of things, where you have, these are the seeds of the Islamic religion. When you move it over, the seeds of what they call the Jewish religion, which had nothing to do with the Jewish people at all. The original Jewish texts were taken and they were twisted like everything else. The Jehovian Anunnaki were running that section for a while. If you trace it up, it takes you into some of the familiar names. Where are they? Somewhere up here. They have the different breakdowns of the Pharisees and Sadducees and these guys that we hear about, in the Bible and in biblical history. These were the lineages that were in control at that point. They were in control, governing religion and governing politics. These were not human races. The whole Exodus thing that happened, it wasn't Jewish people that were running. It was the Hyksos. And I'll talk about the Hyksos in a minute because we're having a problem with the Hyksos on the planet right now. The Adam Kadmon race, that was a combination of the Enochian and Thothian Leviathan races into a master hybrid race, progressively went about raiding other races. They raided the Celtic and the Druidic 12-tribe Magi races, so they took on some of their coding. They're literally on this paper, it gives you a list of the basic small, this is the major invasions, all right? There are millions of smaller ones progressively that took place. By the time we get up to the flood, this is going to be the beginning of clean slate. All right? They orchestrated the flood by messing with the crystals. The whole Noah story, Noah and the ark, has to do with Enoch. Enoch taking a group of his people from Nohasa. They knew because Enoch had joined the Luciferian covenant, they knew that the Samjazi and the Totenki Anunnaki groups were going to create a deluge. They were going to get rid of the people in Atlantis that they didn't want there. So they were going to take their own off planet temporarily so they could get rid of the rest. But Enoch had a particular cluster of his special chosen ones. And because Enoch had forewarning, he didn't warn the rest of them. He only warned the ones that were already beginning to be genetically combined with the Metatronic program through intertwining with the Tothian races. He took them, and he took them from Atlantis by boat to Egypt, to Giza, where the Ark of the Covenant portal exists. He had pass keys to the Ark of the Covenant portal because once upon a time he had been a guardian. And he took those people into Giza through the portals, into the Ark of the Covenant. That was Noah's Ark. It wasn't a boat. There were certain beings that were taken, certain people and some animals and those kind of things that they knew they would need to reseed when they came back up after the deluge. The Ark was the portal passage called the Ark of the Covenant that all of us came in on. Everybody had to come through that to get here on the planet, since seeding free. So these are the stories. This is the truth behind the stories, that pieces of them remained. So the Noah line was the line that came up. It later became the Abraham line. It's the line that came up from this period where Toth and Enoch agreed to follow the Luciferian agenda. And the Luciferian agenda involved the Metatronic Wisadek coding. Because in 22,340 BC is when, this is way before this stuff, that's when Toth decided to lead his peoples into the Metatronic immortal body as opposed to the natural eternal ascension body. When Enoch combined his races with that, they took on the Metatronic coding. So both of them, this is why you'll find teachings of both the Tothian schools, also many of the Egyptian schools, like the Isis schools, all those guys. They were, Isis is another word from Samjazi. All right? I mean, these are the races. When we look and we go, oh, isn't that neat? You know, Isis and Horus and the Egyptian thing. We've been so naive because the history records were taken away from us. It's not so fun and enjoyable when you start to see it. And that's sad because it's like, oh, shoot, our romantic bubbles get burst. At this point, it may be a rude awakening. But if we don't wake up, we can go off and be the little subservient things played with by these false creator gods from now until eternity in a black hole matrix, if that's what we prefer. You know, that choice will be honored. Source is not going to stop you from making the choice. But the truth is recorded in the records, and that's why the truth is being brought, so you can make a conscious choice. Because without this, you're being conned. Without this information, you might, people might hate the messenger, and that's just too bad. You know, I don't take it personally. It's what I stand for, what we stand for, that people have an issue with. But if there's enough love to sit in front of groups of people who might hate us to death for the things we speak because it's crashing their old models of what they thought was real, do you know how much love it takes to do that? It'd be a lot easier to just say, well, fine, you don't want to hear me, I won't talk to you. We don't do that. Now, when we come up, these are the beginnings. Now, the Christ story, of course, fits in here. But first, after the flood, 9558B flood, you had all of these races. It was already planned and positioned which groups were going to invade, which ones would go in which direction. We had, and of course, you had the Draconian Dragon Kings having their own plan of raiding. You had the Jehovian Kings, which were the Jehovian Anunnaki that didn't like the hybrid ones, with their own plan. And you had the Master Race Toth Enoch crew that had their own plans. There's a whole history where they came up through, through the Celtic Druidics. Literally every race line, angelic human race line on the planet, was at a different time systematically infiltrated. And the creeds were forced on them. You know, you either, we're going to control you now, you either buy this and you teach your children this and you do this, or you're dead. Pick one. You know, I mean, that was on a good day. On a bad day, they just come in, kill all the males, take a few females for breeders, and rape them until they conceived, and then force them to bear the children. So they would have, and they used to do this in sacred sex rites, usually under moonlight. They took, there's certain things about conceiving under moonlight. They're actually better for high resonance fetal patterns than during the daytime. They knew these things because of the Atlantean texts that had taught all about sacred sexuality and those kind of things. They used all the teachings against the human race, and they progressively picked up our race lines, our codes, which meant they progressively got more access to the planetary grids. They were picking up each time they created a generation that had another piece of the human DNA in it. They had another piece of the keys to the planetary Templar, because it was the human DNA and the indigo DNA that carried the keys, and still does. Now, we come up through the invasions of Sumer, the Sumerian invasions. All of that was about their history. What we have in our Sumerian, take Sumerian history, all of that stuff was about the Leviathan races. There is not one shred of human history from 9558 BC up to the present. There's not one shred of what was human history. It's E.T. History 101 that we have been reading and being taught ever since the flood. And this was orchestrated, and it was on purpose. It wasn't done by accident. Nothing slipped through, hardly. Little pieces here and there, like the Larsa King tablets that listed a few things and took it back so many generations that, wait a minute, how many generations back was that? There was like hundreds of kings listed on the Larsa King's tablets, and Enoch was in there, so it extended the history context of Sumeria back further than they'd originally assumed. There's a lot of other relics that eventually will come to the surface that that verify this, if we ever get to find them. If things don't get so weird here that archaeology becomes kind of a moot point, it just kind of surfaces itself because everything rearranges itself. Of the Israel territory, the Palestinian territory, what we call Jordan now, all those areas. The Hebrew people were the Grail line for one of our tribes. The Hyksos invaded them. And what we see as Hebrew history right now, the tribe names and all of that, they are not the Hebrew tribe names. The Hebrew had their transposition of race identity done. What you're seeing there is Hyksos. Part of it Hyksos, and part of it the Jehovian branch that came through that didn't want the Hyksos infiltrating. This is why you'll even have different sects within, say, like, the Hebrew religion, or even like the Muslim religion. Everybody's fighting with each other because there were all these different agendas and want to take one pattern hybrid and combine it with another. Anyway, still I'm going. Yeah, I'm doing all right. Now, I just want to get show where this history is, because it's significant. It really, for me anyway, it drove the point home. Well, once we get through the Egypt invasions, and they were, over quite a long period of time, 9558 BC, up through about 5,900, but they continued after that. Every dynasty, every pharaonic dynasty was one of theirs. It was one of the Leviathan king lines that happened to fight its way into position over another competing group. All through this period, the big challenge for the angelic human and the indigo lines was to keep their lineage alive genetically on planet, because they would be exterminated whenever they'd be found out. So oftentimes they would do their best to blend in, the ones who actually knew who they were, where they still had memory of who their lines were. And they would try to pretend to, if you're in Rome, do as the Romans do, just so the Romans don't find out you're not of them, because then they'll kill you, that kind of thing. So we also were scattered. We became scattered all over the place because we couldn't just sit on our gate sites anymore, because they had been infiltrated and invaded. There'd be little clusters left at the gate sites, but the majority of them that we're trying to preserve so the gene line could continue up until this time would literally be scattered in small clusters all over the place and mixed in with everything, so we wouldn't be found. So it would be much more difficult to identify us, so you couldn't go raid the village knowing you were going to get a whole treasure worth of DNA coding from the angelic humans. So we did the Egypt invasions. From the Egypt invasions, went into the Mayan invasions, went into India. In India it was 5,900 BC. This was there was a little bit of the text left, the Mahabharata texts, told about the air wars that took place in that period, where there were spaceships coming in and there were some fighting in the skies, because certain groups tried to take over, and the other Leviathans didn't like it, and the Guardian races got involved because they were going to exterminate, everything was going to get exterminated. So there was a skirmish, let's say, in 5,900 BC, and there's still record of that in the Indian or the Hindu texts. We get in 3,650 BC, the Mayan raid started to take place, which was Thoth's crew going over into, and remember, going over isn't hard, A, if you have a spaceship, or B, if you know how to work the surface portals, which are the ones that connect Earth points to Earth points as opposed to like inner Earth or other places. And some of the portal systems were operational. So they could get from one place to another. I mean, you see these charts of, oh yes, humanity started here, possibly in Africa, and then moved up this way, and you see the little arrows of how they say, by finding the archaeological evidence, like, oh, we found bodies here and bodies here, so that means they must have done this. They have no clue. I mean, when you just take them all up in the air and put them on spaceships and things like that, it makes it much more complicated than simply trying to find the archaeological trail as to where what races existed. It's even harder to find it when you have a bunch of Leviathan races and fallen angelic races, or ETs, whatever you want to call them, coming in and manipulating the paper trail behind them. They didn't want things found. They got rid of most of, and there wasn't too many of them to begin with, the bodies of the cloister races. They had elongated heads and they were very tall. There's been a few they missed, and they were found, I think they were found in Peru or something, weren't they? Or South America somewhere, I think. But they have to say that these were beings that suffered from encephalitis, I think they said, swelling of the brain that made their heads grow bigger. Yeah, swelling of the brain, all right. That's what happens when you have larger brains. You know, there has been a progressive sweep, and right now we're in the middle, still in the middle of this. Science is hugely controlled on this planet. What the common people are allowed, even in America, where the home, you know, the land of the free and the home of the brave. Yeah, land of the free. That's a joke. It's no better than any other place in that sense, other than we get to play around in our hologram and think we're free more than most people do. It doesn't change the fact that we're in a prison camp. This planet has been a prison camp since Atlantis, and we have a chance to evolve out of that now. And this is what the three paths of Genesis are about. When we come up through Egypt, through through India, through the Mayan raids, takes us up into where they start moving into. This is where we get into the Abraham lines, about 2075 BC. 2075 BC is when the person known as Abraham came into being. And Abraham was out of the Adam Kadmon Hyksos line. And he was combined with some other lines. See, they were trying to get together as many of these diversified Antichristos Grail lines to create a super race. So they were doing their best to combine lines. Abraham marked another upgrade where they combined Hyksos, which were also called the Midianites. The Hyksos were also called the Midianites. They combined them with another branch of somebody or other coming down from the Jehovian lines, the Nohasa lines. So it was taking originally one of the group of Jehovian Anunnaki Leviathan that wouldn't join the Enoch crew. These guys came in then. And progressively, this led up to the dramas that we think we know something about. It led up to first of all, between 1670 BC and 1550 BC, the Hyksos invaded Egypt completely, and they took over. They were the ruling party there. And then they wonder why they got in trouble. They came and took over some of the other draconian Leviathan races that were running there. And then with a vengeance, they came back, and the Hyksos had to do their exodus. They were kicked out of Egypt because they had come in, taken over, which at the time in Egypt, the draconian Leviathan races had, their pharaonic rule had taken hold. These guys came in, the Hyksos came in, the master race, they took over them, then they got taken over in return. Through this thing, you have the Moses story that evolves. Moses was one of the Hyksos. In fact, he was, the whole Moses story is meant to cover up the fact that he was the son of one of the pharaohs that he was supposed to be on the opposite side of. This was during the Tutmosis period. All right, the Exodus took place during the Tutmosis 1 and 2, I think. I have that someplace. It's in the records. So, I mean, the whole thing with Solomon's Temple was all of these things, all of these pieces of history fit into this line. When it came up into like 700 and it was actually about 800 BC time period, this is where you had the Roman invasions and the Greek invasions, where you had various groups. First the Draconian Leviathan came in, and literally the Remus and Romulus story in the Roman things that supposedly were the beginnings of the Roman Empire, they were the Draconian races. They were, Remus, I believe, was the Odedicron reptilian, and Romulus was the Omicron dragon moth. All right, so you had the draconian reptilian presence starting in here. These are the guys that became the Knights of Knossos and the Knights Malta and that kind of thing. And they had come up from, earlier on the Etruans and the Lathians and those guys, like further back in Atlantis. When we come up to about another level, a bunch of other stuff went down. But when we, let's see, there's one place I want to go from Rome. Oh, it was about 23 BC when we started to see, 23, 24 BC, we started to see the Roman invasion by the Hyksos and the Anunnaki Leviathan races, where they were going to come over and do the, like they were doing the Olympian god stuff and all of that kind of thing. Now there was one version of the Omicron Dracs that were beginning the Olympian paradigm, because that particular group had made alliances with the Wesedex. So there were both Draconian and Anunnaki races that made alliances with the Wesedex, and this was the Metatronic coding. So we have a history of the most bizarre, slow, talk about painful, slow death. It's like if you're going to wipe out a race, just drop a bomb on it and let it go. This has been torture. We have lived torture, and most of us sit here and haven't a clue, and we still call the names of the gods that they gave to us that weren't the gods that we started out with. And it's really, really sad. That's where I can find enough healthy anger. I don't care who listens to me or who doesn't. If one person in a group of 1 million gets it and can get free from this before they end up metatronically coded for eternity, it's worth it. So anyway, comes up to the Christ period in Voyages Volume 2, even before we began to play Whistleblower, when the United Resistance was formed and they declared war on us, before the Palladian-Syrian agreements were broken, the 1992 agreements were broken. The story was very gently done without letting any of the history about the Anunnaki, because the Anunnaki were trying to make agreement. You know, they supposedly were going to enter the Emerald Covenant. We had to be very, very careful about how much history we were allowed, the Guardians were allowed to release while those agreements were holding, because part of their things, their demands, were we don't tell right away. Of course, we'd have to tell later, but let them get used to us first before they realize what we did here, because then they'll really hate our guts, right? That was basically what was happening. In September of 2000, when the Anunnaki broke the Palladian-Syrian agreements, they joined the United Resistance, and the whole group of them literally made an edict of war against the founders. And that's when it was time to get the history out and let people know what's going on. So, in the Voyagers book, it talks about the Christ period and the two Christs. Actually, the three sort of Christs. There were the original Christ, which was Jeshua 12. He was called Jeshua 12. And at some point, they'll reveal the last name of the family line. His mother's last name was Constantine, but that was not the father's last name. And I know that because I was his half-sister, and we had the same mother. So in that time period, my name was Miriam. That was the Constantine line that came up, you know, since that period. There was another attempt to bring certain groups of the Hyksos over into the Emerald Covenant. You had a group called Galactic Federation of certain of the Anu Seraphim Anunnaki and the Jehovian Anunnaki, who decided they'd enter the Emerald Covenant. And they were doing this for a reason. They were doing it primarily because they knew it was getting closer. All right, this is like 2,000 years ago. It's getting closer to when everybody knew the stargates were to open again, which was during this time period. And they knew that without bioregenesis assistance, their races were definitely going into the Wesedek matrix. There was still, they had about 2/3 of the Wesedek coding. There was still 1/3 left. There was enough left that they could have been brought back to at least be able to stay in Phantom, to where they could bioregenesis out from there after quite a long course of evolution. There were certain ones that had, of the Toth crew, that had originally decided to do the Metatronics, then decided they didn't want to do the Metatronics anymore. They didn't want to become Wesedeks anymore, because they were finding out that the Wesedeks were actually quite bullies. And they'd give you menial positions like middle management, but you'd never make it to the top. You know, that kind of thing. So there was some rebellion taking place within the Toth group, and Enoch just kept getting himself and his people all tangled up in messes, and it was just really poor judgment. I have a soft spot for Enoch, even though he's made some horrible decisions, because at least, I mean, there's still a twist of arrogance that tends to go with anything that incarnates through the Anunnaki or the fallen Anu Elohim pattern. He picked that up. He was an ascendant master that came through that pattern to get down here. He picked a bit of that up toward his people, the chosen ones, you know. In other words, you guys aren't worthy, but you guys are. You know, this is an elitist standpoint. The chosen one issue has always been about elitism, and it's always been chosen by who is the first question. So anyway, when we got to the Christ period, there was an attempt at, again, and this had really started before. It had started in the Solomon period, and Solomon had been a part of the beginnings of this, and then it fell apart again, and we tried it again with, during the Christ period, where taking certain ones of the Hyksos, and they were the master raider races at this point. They had the most powerful DNA, compared to a human on the planet. They were brought into the Emerald Covenant, and they were to go, it was an allowance of, after they would undergo certain rites that would assist them using codes to clear the DNA to some degree, they would then intermarry with Magi, Grail line Magi, to be able to begin a generation that would rapidly be able to get the coding back up before this time period. So this is where the Essenes came from. The Essenes were a group of, they were a subfamily of the Melchizedeks, which were one of the cloister angelic human races. So Essenes were naturally one of those families. The indigos that got involved with this experiment, which were the Jeshua 12 line, were of the Melchizedek Essene lineage, in the angelic human indigo lineage. They were to combine from Solomon. It started with Solomon and Bathsheba, I believe she was one of ours, and created the Solomon line. Now, Jeshua 12 came out of the Solomon line. He was the real Jeshua. He was the real Jesus. He was the one that went around teaching ascension. He did not teach hierarchical ascension. He did not have disciples under him or below him. He taught as a group. He taught with a group of Magi that went around together to bring back the teachings of the Emerald Covenant. And we did a pretty good job. We got a lot of them. We were putting them in writing at that point. They were put in several different writings. They were put in Egyptian. They were put in Hebrew. They were put in the Hindu languages, Sanskrit languages, and they were put in Chinese and a couple other dialects. So they would be pieces, at least, would survive. Because we knew as soon as they hit the papyrus, they would, somebody grab a hold of them and they would change, or either be destroyed or completely rewritten. But in the Christ period, this is where the Arimathea agenda, which had started way back in Atlantis, the Arimathea agenda was the Metatronic agenda. This is where it became woven into the biblical story. We caused them a lot of problems by bringing Jeshua 12 in. There was a whole bunch of people learning again about the ancient history. We were teaching about Atlantis. We were teaching about the stellar activation cycle that was due in this period of time and how we were all preparing for that. We caused a real problem for the for the Pharisees and the Sadducees and a bunch of others, the Romans. A lot of people were very upset with us. Okay, still doing right. There was a very big need to cover up what took place in the Christ period. Now, we were doing all right until what we call a period called the Essene Divide, and that's an event that's listed on this paper as it basically, it was a few years before and quite a few years after, but the kind of high point of it was 23 AD. Now, Jeshua was born, we call him Jeshua 12, because he was carrying the 12 strand pattern stuff. He was born in 12 BC, and he finally ascended through the Ark of the Covenant in 27 AD. That's because the mission got blown. The mission wasn't supposed to get blown. Now, in the agreements that were made, there was another, let's call him junior avatar, that was allowed to come in on the bioregenesis experiment. He was named Jeshua, and it was spelled with a Y, the way the Hyksos, not Hebrews, but the Hyksos alphabet didn't have the J in it. The original Hebrew alphabet did, for anybody that knows, that little twist on the names. Jeshua 9, Jeshua, this was the line where you get Mary and Joseph, all right? The mother and father of that one were Mary and Joseph. Johias and Judy were the parents of Jeshua 12, the real Jesus. Now, neither of these guys got crucified. They were actually working as a team. Jeshua 12 ordinated Jeshua 9 into the Melchizedek cloister priesthood. John the Baptist had ordinated Jesus, Jeshua 12, into the priesthood. These were the Magi, and we were attempting to create a new hybrid Grail line that had the potential to bring back the full Christos pattern to those races. And because the Hyksos races had invaded everything they could get their hands on since Atlantis, they had the most coding of everything. So that race was chosen for that opportunity because they could connect genetically to just about everything. They also had a huge amount of the coding that went with the planetary grids. Well, everything was going fine, and Enoch at this point had actually come back into the Emerald Covenant and decided he wanted to be a part of it. Thoth was doing one of these as usual, where Galactic Federation had kind of convinced the Thoth Pleiadian Anunnaki crew to do it, to enter the Emerald Covenant. Except they had an agenda. They weren't planning on staying. They were planning on making sure this avatar of theirs was born, and then taking that further into the future on their own agenda. And that's precisely what they did. They created, once Jeshua 9, we call him Jeshua 9, was born, there's progressive infiltration of the Pleiadian Nibiran Anunnaki via Galactic Federation. Galactic Federation, the one that likes to channel books these days, were back there then. In fact, they're the ones that helped to take out Solomon's temple by accident. Yeah, they blew up their own temple by accident. Won't even get into that now. But anyway, in the Arimathea agenda, which the Anunnaki groups and the Hyksos Leviathan races had given lip service to giving up. They wanted to be healed from that. They came up from Atlantis. Once Jeshua 9 was born, the showdown began. Galactic Federation pulled out of the Emerald Covenant, and so did the Thoth group. And now they had their super hybrid Hyksos that had the coding of the Magi, the genetic coding of the Magi. So it was, again, another notch up as far as getting security codes to the planetary stargates and creating a master raider race. But what they had to do was cover up anything that had to do with the real Jeshua, because if they didn't, there would be too much knowledge that would be written. I mean, when we would get books down, you give them 6 months in those days, and they'd be something different. So there was like several copies of things handwritten, and one would be the real one, and you'd hide that somewhere special. And then you'd have ones that had certain alterations put in them that would, if you read them right, lead you to where the real one might be. Right? All sorts of games being played back then by both sides just to keep, the truth on the planet, and the other guy's trying to get rid of it. So the Arimathea agenda got interwoven into what we call the Bible, even before the Council of Nicaea finalized what the Bible would become. Even in like 100 BC, we had the Hyksos Arimathea agenda coming up. You'll find the Hyksos writings in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran Dead Sea Scrolls. These were a group of the Hyksos races that were associated with the Essenes, yes, the ones they had raided and gotten part of the gene code from, because Essenes were around for, as long as the root races and the cloister races were around, because Essene is simply one of the smaller families of the Melchizedek cloister angelic human race. All right. So when you see the Dead Sea Scrolls stuff, this is coming from the Hyksos perspective. All of these things were building up. So by the time the Christ drama unfolded and the betrayal took place in 23 AD, we couldn't finish the mission that we had started here for, which was to bring the races back into wholeness, into oneness, to prepare everybody for the stellar activation cycle of this time period, so everybody would be able to make it through, and Earth would be reborn into a new age of light, and everybody would be welcome there as long as they behaved and stopped trying to hurt other people. In the Essene Divide, we called it the Essene Divide, because you had some of the ones with the Essene coding that had come up from the Hyksos that had raided Essene races, and they're the ones that had been combined with the true Essenes, the Grail lines. You had a divide between them that took place, and this is where our contemporary understanding of the nonsense that comes up from that time period in the Bible references and things, where the true Grail line, Jeshua ascended. I mean, he just left through the Ark of the Covenant. He didn't die. He wasn't crucified. He wasn't even persecuted. It was the other guy that had the big mouth. I mean, I hate to say it that way, but, being told he's holier than thou by his fallen Anu Elohim friends, and that it was his job to convert everybody over to the thing, he got a little too outspoken, let's say. And he did indeed. Like we had groups of 12 knights, let's say, like the round table knights around us. Well, he decided to do disciples, which was, I'm above you and you're going to listen to me, kind of stuff. Jeshua 9 reflected very much the mentality of those who were guiding him and directing him. He was an incarnate out of one of the fallen Enu Elohim collectives. He was an avatar, a 9th level avatar, a D9 avatar, oversoul, that came in order to do this. And he was supposed to stay on the side of the Emerald Covenant. But when he didn't, there was this whole new path of evolution that was going to be run, and it was going to be run through the biblical story. So they took pieces of the ancient Hyksos distortions, the stuff from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and even back way further into the Hebrew traditions that went back into Atlantis, and they began to weave tales, and they began to edit things out that anybody else wrote down that didn't fit into those tales. So the Arimathea, or Metatronic agenda, began being woven progressively into what has become Christianity on this planet, which was interesting because, all right, now what happened to Jeshua 9, he didn't get crucified either. There was another guy that, because Jeshua 9 went around and really agitated the Romans and a few other people and got too much attention drawn to himself, they had to get him out of the Holy Land. They had to literally get him and his family out because they were going to kill them if they stuck around, and they couldn't let that happen. He had that new gene code. Can't let him get killed. He has to have more babies. This is really how the Enu Elohim were perceiving the whole thing. So there was a guy named Arahabi who looked like him physically, who resembled him physically. And the Enu Elohim sent him on a few little tangents of inspired visions and things and convinced him that he was Christ, and got him spouting some of the teachings so he would sound enough like him. And they set Arahabi up. And they told him he couldn't ascend. He didn't have a gene code where he could ascend, but they told him that they would give him the gene code, the Metatronic version, that he could ascend if he would allow himself to die for his God. He was crucified. So there was a man crucified, but it wasn't either of the Jeshuas. It was Arahabi, who was a poor sucker. He was conned by having visions given to him by a bunch of fallen angelics who told him if he let himself be tortured this way, that God would reward him with an eternal body. Well, it wasn't eternal. It might have been immortal, but it wasn't eternal. All right. So there is some reality to the crucifixion story. It was part of the cover-up of the real Christian story, which has always been about bringing the inner Christos teachings here. That's what Jeshua taught. That's what the other Jeshua was supposed to teach, and he started to. Now, where Jeshua 9 went, he had Jeshua 12, literally in 27 AD, ascending back up the Ark of the Covenant. He left. John the Baptist went in his own direction. He got killed. And Miriam stuck around for a while and ascended, maybe, I think of it, what was it, 20, what did I do? I forget, 37 AD? Something like that. I think it was 37, yeah. It's about 10 years after Jeshua. And we did what we could, but what we were there for couldn't be finished. And it was all kind of left till next round. And this goes up, like, next round, like, took us in through the Arthur legends and all of that stuff, King Arthur and all that. That was all about this. But the important thing to see here was Arimathea is tracking it. There was, and Ma'a is telling me this now, who this person was, because I was trying to find out who exactly it was, and Ma'a is verifying something, that a person named Joseph of Arimathea was the brother of, get this please, what's the brother, would you please catch this? The brother of the person who was Mary, Mother Mary, okay, the brother of Mother Mary's mother. Okay, that's how I just worded it. What does that make him? The brother of Mother Mary's mother.
Mother Mary's mother.
So it's Mary's uncle.
Yeah.
Mary's uncle? Yeah, that would be Mary's uncle. Okay. Now, he was of, I believe the history has him in Palestine, of Arimathea. In fact, there was a place called Arimathea in Palestine. And I wonder who settled that place. It was Hyksos. And there was an exodus of the Hyksos Grail line, the Jeshua 9 line. They got Mary out. Mary Magdalene is who he had married. They got Mary Magdalene out. Now, there's a little twist I got to share with this. Mary Magdalene was intended to be the wife of Jeshua 12. It was his twin flame. And they messed with her before she woke up, and they married her off to Jeshua 9 in order to get the gene code. And that was part of the reason Jeshua left, because there was nothing left for him to do. He left children behind, though. He didn't marry any of the mothers. It was done through sacred rites within the temple, and certain women were chosen. There were 6 women chosen, and there were fathers who would be the fathers of these children to raise these children as their own. And it was simply that it was a very sacred leaving behind of a gene code before he ascended. So there were 6 lineages from Jeshua 12, the indigo lines, that came up from that period. But what happened to the other guys, the J9 lines, who'd hijacked Mary, and this is causing Sananda a problem right now, because Mary got Metatronic coding, his twin. So right now, Sananda's main mission is to work with Galactic Federation to try to get, and Sananda was the soul name of Jeshua 12. He has to get Mary, his twin, the other half of his entity, out of the Metatronic coding. So he's a bit busy in this particular time frame. That's why you'll find both Jeshua 9 and, reluctantly, Jeshua 12 working with the Galactic Federation people, with the Anunnaki people right now, because he has a karmic issue to settle, where he has to help his twin flame, to his twin avatar, to get out of the Metatronic coding before she goes down. Because if she goes down, he's stuck in this, this matrix with the other half of him coded over there. So there's some issues that came up out of that period. It was awful what happened in that period. It was the Essene Divide period. And what's come out of that has been even more awful. Because what they did was Joseph of Arimathea, of Palestine, Mary's uncle, got the bunch of them out. Now, he had a lot of trafficking because he was involved with, I think it was gold, wasn't it? With gold mines? Yeah, he was like the Ministry of Mines of Rome.
Tin and Cornwall as well.
Tin and Cornwall? Okay. Because he had connections to England and also to France, because they went to France first. Joseph of Arimathea got them into France. And there was a group, they had, they talk about getting sucker punched. There was a group of Cathars. The Cathars of France were portions of what became the Cathars of France, were some of the Jeshua 12 lineage people that had been, moved around. We didn't just leave them all in the Holy Land. We had to put them at different areas. They were put at Gate 12, which is Montsegur in France. That's where the original Cathars started. Well, before we had full-blown Cathars, we had gene lines being filtered up into this direction. Okay, we had our Grail lines there. We had our Gate 12 Grail lines there from the beginning. They were always there because Gate 12 is Montsegur, France. So we would have Tribe 12 people there. The Tribe 12 Grail lines would be there, and so would the root races be there. Well, the Arimathea, Joseph of Arimathea, brought the Hyksos, Jesus, into the 12 tribes regions of France, and at first was able to pass him off as the other Jeshua, because people weren't in active open communication with each other. So he was taken in, and they created a following there. This is where you had, before the Cathars even became officially called Cathars, you had the Cathar Divide that was part of the Essene Divide. You had a group in a Grail line, an Antichristos Hyksos Grail line, that came up living in the same spaces as the Grail lines that went with Tribe 12. Now, later, Jeshua 12's descendants, one of them, came and was brought in to bring up the Tribe 12 lineage again, because it had been contaminated by the Hyksos, the Hyksos Jeshua. So, out of France, you have two movements building. You have the Cathars, and Cathar was just like Cathara, healing. It was originally spelled with a K. It referred to Ka-tha-ra, light, sound, one. That's what the word meant. It got changed into Cathari with a C, and this had to do with not just the Hyksos, but also the Dracs getting in on the act. You also had, during this period, the beginnings of what became Draconian Christianity, as opposed to Anunnaki Christianity. So you had the Bible stories, the stories coming up from this chaos that came out of the two Jeshuas and the lineage moving into France. It moved from France and then spread into England and into other places. It seeded the Templar quest and the Arimathea agenda. It was seeded through Joseph of Arimathea and through Jeshua 9 and Mary and Joseph, who were the parents of Jeshua 9. this was a betrayal of the Emerald Covenant. The people who were representing the Christos teachings kind of got knocked in the head again, but the drama continued. But this is, what became of this was very interesting, because by 325 AD, a couple hundred years after all this was taking place, the Draconians got in on the picture. The Hyksos were making so much advancement by putting out their records, by combining it with the records from the past and putting the Joshua 9 story out as if it were the real story, and hiding and destroying any records that were existing on Joshua 12 and, the true Miriam and, John the Baptist. They changed names. They took certain stories that took place here and they changed the order of this person was first and that person was second, as far as, birth times. For instance, they put John the Baptist as almost in a similar, time frame, age bracket as Jeshua, and he wasn't. He was much, much older. So they doctored the documents, the historical documents, got rid of what didn't serve them. They were doing really, really well, and that really, really upset the Draconian mob over in Rome. So the Draconian mob over in Rome decided to take all of this new information, this new Christ period stuff, and make their own version of it. And they combined it with the Olympian god stuff that they had taken from the Anunnaki originally. They had taken over some of that. They were using that to control the Roman people, the Roman empires. They combined it, and what used to be the Olympian gods became saints instead. So they renamed them. They made them saints, okay? You couldn't have Olympian gods anymore. You could have saints. They decided this was a good bandwagon to jump on. And the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD brought together Pharisees, Sadducees, people from, people in control of large groups where they had to deal with this problem about what do we do with the records? We might not like each other, but we all have one common interest to make sure we win when the stellar activation cycle comes. So there was a book assimilated and created out of editing, twisting, and taking most of the guts out of the historical records. They used some of our records, they used some of the falsified records, these are the parts that will be compatible with the Qumran stuff, the Dead Sea Scroll stuff. And they created what we call the Bible. And as we know, the history from there has been absolute chaos, where the Draconian, now what's interesting too, is you had the Draconian versions, the Draconian Leviathan races, which were became the Knights Gnosis, the Knights Malta. They became the push behind Catholicism. Then you had the Hyksos lines that became the push behind Protestantism. This is where you have the division between Catholic and Protestant. It's Dragon Anunnaki, as usual. It's like humans just never fit into this history here. We're watching wars go on between people who don't even belong here in the first place, and the people who do belong here think they're a part of it, and they don't know how to step outside of it because their own history is gone. So that leads us up to the point where we are here. Yeah, we're doing good. Okay, that's good. Now, good. I'll leave him 10 minutes and me about 8. Okay, that was actually good. So I think that's enough of the history so you can understand how the things that we're talking about now, there is a context for these. It's not some idea we pulled off the top of our head and we're trying to con you into believing. There's a history here. It's not a pleasant history. It's a history that makes you want to cry. At least it does me. It's been horrible. It's been horrible for the Grail lines. It's been horrible for the angelic humans. And it's been horrible for any of the Leviathan races who tried to escape from it. Because the fallen angelic collectives that control them and who can mess with them because of the DNA weaknesses, they have more of the reversals in their DNA, especially the ones with the Metatronic coding. They can be, put that little CD in their heads and you can show them pictures, you can give them divine experiences that aren't real. This is how we've been manipulated all through this process. Now, what it leads us to is the beast. In 22,340 BC, when Thoth's group agreed to join the Weesadex, this was a thing called the Luciferian. Remember, Thoth was one of the Luciferian groups. This was the Lucifer Archangel Michael Alliance. Okay, now they had been against each other for quite a while. Thoth didn't want, the Weesadek coding. For a long time he'd stood against that when he was Emerald. When he went over, this was the alliance between Lucifer, Thoth, and his whole collective. It wasn't just one person, it was the whole collective, and the Weesadex. Now the Weesadex had interbred, when they had broken through here 570 million years ago, they created a race in the Andromeda system of phantom matrix called the Necromaton. The Necromaton later raided seeding 2 of the angelic humans, creating something called the Nephilim. All right, they were an Anunnaki, a mutated Anunnaki Wisadek thing. When Archangel Michael, these became the Archangel Michael Collective. They were the Mikalub. They were called the Mikalub. And they were also called the Sons of Baal, B-A-A-L. And in some, like, doctrines that came up, Baal was another word for the devil, you know. Everybody was calling everybody the devil. I mean, whoever, if you didn't like him, you called that one the devil. You had Satan, you had Lucifer, you had Baal, you had Set in Egypt. I mean, you had a bunch of them. And it all depended on who was writing the book that would say, you know, which one was the bad one or which one was the good one. The Protestant movement that has come up through the Freemasons, for instance, that's the Hyksos line, came up through the Freemasons, that is actually the controlling faction behind Protestant religion. But most of the Protestant figureheads on the outside have no clue about that. They actually hold at the center of their creed a worship of Lucifer, which means they're Tothian. Right? Yeah, I mean, the others have at their core, the Catholic ones, they actually have at their core a connection to Satan, which is the Marduk-Draman line of Anunnaki Omicron, that this is where the Satan stuff comes from. So it's a riot. It's almost like at the core of each of the religions, the one they're saying the one that is evil is actually the one they're supporting. It's like the one that's motivating the whole thing. It's been such a very confusing game. But anyway, it leads us to the present moment where we have technologies, sci-fi technologies that aren't fiction, that have been progressively put in place here, and we've been progressively mutated so we wouldn't know how to handle it or even believe it was there by the time the cell activation cycle came. We have what are called there are several different layers of technology that if we could have got the grids up high enough in speed, we wouldn't have had to worry about this one. This one was the worst case scenario. Like, oh dear. The Guardians have been doing everything that they could. I mean, even negotiating with these bozos. Because they're bozos. I mean, you know, oh yeah, we'll give you lip service for like, 24 hours. They will turn around and stab you in the back. This has been the history of dealing with the Anunnaki races, particularly on Earth. But even that was worth a try. Because if the 1992 Pleiadian-Sirian agreements had worked, where they were Emerald Covenant agreements, where the Thoth groups and the Enoch groups had decided they would come in and stand against the Draconian groups in order to not let the Draconian groups get control. If they had held, we wouldn't have had to worry about activation of the beast. The beast is a mechanism that the scope of the intelligence it takes to create something like this is awesome, because it's something that moves not just planets, it moves solar systems. It has the capacity to take this solar system and our whole chain of gates going from here to D11. That takes us up through up into the Lyris system. Literally take the whole thing down into a black hole matrix. Which means its matter would fry, first of all. Everything totally gets disintegrated going through a black hole. Then it reforms in disorganized fashion on the other side. It would reform on the other side, neatly tucked in to the base 8 reverse Metatronic coding. Now, if we look at this crazy diagram, this will get easier when I typeset it because there are little tiny words all over. It was hard enough to understand when I showed it to you where the 3 axes were coming through, where we showed. Could you hold? Yeah. Thank you, Lovey. Okay. Where we had up here the Wisadek axis, right? There's like a Cathara grid running at this angle, right? Then we had over here the phantom axis running down this way, and then our main axis, right? Now what's been added to this diagram is, first of all, showing you something that was put in 25,500 BC, when the Palladian Nibiru and Anunnaki groups put in something called the Nibiruan Dadic crystal grid. That was the thing that was anchored at Stonehenge and then plugged into 24 prime crystal temple bases all over the planet. This is part of what we're clearing in our site work that we're doing here. The Nibiru used to be a planet that orbited within our galactic plane. It was our 12th planet for a while. Now, when they started to build the beast, Nibiru became our 11th planet first, because our 11th planet, which was Chiron, was broken in half. Part of it was made Pluto's moon, and the other part of it was stuck where it pops up in between Saturn and Uranus, and then it pops back down into Phantom. Now these are, it's almost like balances, weights, trying to get the balance, the electromagnetic balance just right. In order to do this stuff, you have to have the absolutely perfect electromagnetic balances of energy, of push and pull, etc., on a galactic and higher than galactic level. So Nibiru used to orbit this way. They changed that orbit. First, they knocked it in when they got rid of Gate 11 planet Charon and broke it into two. They then pushed, using frequency, using their gates, they pushed Nibiru into the 11 position. They left a hole where the 11 planet had been. There was a hole in that orbital field, and they plugged Nibiru into that hole. From there, they created a link where they took Nibiru, and this wasn't all done at once, but in 25,500 BC, they did this final piece. Once Nibiru had moved from the 12 spot to the 11 spot, 25,500 BC, they dragged it in to this orbital, okay, to the phantom orbital, with another large planetary or half a planetary mass. It used to be a planet called Maldak, which was our fifth planet. That was destroyed in seeding 2, as was Charon. Now, Maldak, there's a piece of Maldak that was large enough to counterbalance Nibiru, where it had about the same planetary mass. So they were able to set up, using this gate alignment, the phantom races were able to set up an orbit of Nibiru to make it like a patrol station, where on one end of the orbit you'd have the planet Nibiru, and on the other end you'd have the piece of Maldak that they turned into a battle star that came to be known as Wormwood, which was a mistranslation of what meant Doom World. Because it was always known that Doom World, when that battle star, Nibiruan battle star, came in, it would have the potential to pull our matrix into phantom matrix. That was before the whole Weesadek mess, before we had to deal with the whole Weesadek mess. And what they did, they took advantage of the phantom technology. Now, this was the phantom races at first, deciding they were going to do this. The Palladian Iberians were part of this. They weren't, remember, Thoth broke the Emerald Covenant in 22,340 BC. This thing was put in 25,500 BC. So that was before that. There's not the Weesadek agreement yet. They still have their matrix coming in here. But right now the phantom races are trying to pull our matrix in to create enough critical mass in their matrix so the Weesadeks can't pull them in because they're fighting them. So originally Nibiru would do this. It would this is the axis that the new Nibiru in orbit would create. It would begin here, and it would cycle up this way. It would cross over through their Phantom Gate 8, which would be Phantom Alnitak Orion. It would circle back down, and it's still, where you see the dotted line? That dotted line is its phantom passage, all right? It's not passing through our system yet. This is the phantom level of our system, where it's not touching us yet. It would come back down this side. Then when it did a full pass through the phantom system, it would do a loop-de-loop down here, and then come back up this way, and it would pass through our system this way, going straight out. Now, we have our sun here, Earth over here. The positioning it would come in would be here. It wouldn't come close enough to cause major cataclysmic mess on Earth. It would create a bit of ripples, and sometimes you get a slight pole shift, but it wasn't the huge cataclysmic scale. And it would pass back out. Now, when one was out, the other would be in. Every 3,657.8 years, one of them would come in. And when it was Nibiru coming in, Wormwood was out. And when Wormwood would come in, Nibiru was out. Right now, we're approaching a period where Nibiru's out, but Wormwood's on its way in. And this was part of what the biblical teachings had taught a lot more about, but there was little bits of it left in the Nicene translations that tell, in Revelations, that tell us about these things. Now, the beast comes in here, where the Weesadeks decided they could take advantage of this. Now, this was originally a small beast that was intended to pull us in to prevent the Weesadeks from pulling the phantom matrix in. They figured out how to use it to get both. They made their link, their 666 link, through Their Stargate 6, our Stargate 6, and the Phantom Stargate 6, and they anchored it into our sixth, the Stargate in our sixth planetary core. Our sixth planet is Jupiter, because 5 was Maldak, and Maldak's the asteroid belt now, because it was blown, the rest of it was blown to smithereens, and the big part of it was used as the battle star for Nibiru. They created this frequency bridge here that anchors the 666 through Jupiter, and what this will allow through Jupiter, there are frequencies that are transmitted that when Nibiru begins, or either Nibiru or the battle star, but this time it's going to be the battle star in this cycle, when it comes up and hits the level of orbit, it comes up like from down here. This is actually Orion down here. It's like where our Stargate 1 is. This is Trapezium Orion and Orion's sword. Then it moves toward us through Stargate 2 domain, which is Epsilon in Eridanus, and it progressively moves toward our system. It comes up under and comes through in the asteroid belt. So this is where it enters our galactic plane, is through the asteroid belt. When this happens, this beast, the frequencies here activate. These are the blue sword, the flaming blue sword of Archangel Michael frequencies. They beam a frequency through the Jupiter orbit template, and it reverses the path that either Nibiru or Wormwood in this case would take. So it should be coming up, doing this and going past us, where it comes up here, hits that frequency, reverses, comes back here, cuts between Earth and the Sun, circles back around, makes a second pass on the other side of Earth, and then comes out this way across our whole galactic plane, and then up and out, linking the whole thing into this orbital plane and literally pulling the whole thing down and under. In more practical terms, more easy to understand terms, what this means is a planetary body at least twice the size of Earth passing between Earth and the Sun. That is a problem. Now, this is set in motion through activation of the turnstiles. We talk about the turnstile grids. They were part of the Atlantean mess that was put in when Thoth agreed to turn part of the Nibiru and Datic crystal grid that had belonged to them in the Phantom Matrix, turn part of that over to the Wesedex. Right now, they're running those frequencies. Now, the beast wasn't due to raise its nasty head until 2011. That was originally, if the stellar activation cycle progressed the way it was intended to, and 2012 was supposed to be the opening of the full halls of Amente Stargates, our Stargates here. Wasn't supposed to happen until 2011 when they activated the beast. There are already groups on planet that are being conned into creating manual physical technologies that are needed to help anchor these frequencies. There's a group of ETs pretending they're the nice ETs. They call themselves the Cordium. They've been working with the Wingmakers group in New Mexico, and they've been getting this labyrinth group of humans, they call themselves the labyrinth group, to help them build certain technologies, because they keep telling them there's this big bad invader race that's going to come in, and the only way to protect the planet is by building these devices. They're the invader race. I mean, talk about conning somebody. The people that are working with the Ringmakers Labyrinth Project, they're humans like us that think they're doing the right thing, and they're being taught to build the technologies that they need to do the final anchoring on planet. HARP is a part of this, the HARP installations, and there are several others. The Star Wars program was part of that also, but that kind of got nixed, and there's going to be certain things put in probably with that. We'll probably see some advancement of the need for some type of Star Wars type technology. The space station stuff has all been part of this, because a bunch of the Illuminati head guys running around on planet know we've been under invasion. They've known it since the 1930s. And they know that there is cataclysmic stuff potentially coming. They knew that because the other guys, the fallen angelics, are planning on activating this. Our guys are trying to stop it, to get to the point where this would not activate. We were doing well, so well, that they activated it early.